Hey there, Trooper Stars. Dave Schmidt here. And today we're going to talk about what is Dungeons and Dragons, or what is D&D, for us cooler kids.
Hey, who are those people?
Those are the RPGers. We've been trying to get them thrown off campus for years, but they're just too popular. Until we can get them banished for good, it would be best if you just kept away from them.
Alright, so what is D&D? And I guess I'll start by saying that Dungeons and Dragons is a framework for telling epic stories. I mean, look at this guy. He looks pretty epic and crazy, and there's a little guy down there fighting him. But it's more than just telling stories. It's telling stories in a game. So just as any game, video game, board game, there's usually a story and a story arc that you follow as you play the game. It's kind of like that, except in this game, there's someone called the Dungeon Master, and look at this crazy Dungeon Master. Well, this is the book they might be using. Who controls everything. He's like the referee, the main storyteller. He or she is the one who comes up with everything, generally. And then there's a bunch of players. So the Dungeon Master controls all we call them NPCs, all the non-player characters. Those could be monsters, townspeople, all sorts of things. The players control just one character, and that's their player character. So they're each acting as one individual in this story. The main characters, really. And then the Dungeon Master, who some people think of that person as against the players, but that's not true. The Dungeon Master, or the Game Master in Dungeons and Dragons, is the person who controls everything else. So all the other characters in the story. All the villains, all the ancillary characters, all the love interests maybe. Every character that isn't controlled by the other players. Alright, so I said it was a game, right? And games have rules. So how does kind of a free-form storytelling game work? How does the Game Master, or the Dungeon Master, and the players to a lesser extent, shape that story in that world? What are the rules to this game? Well, whenever someone wants to do something in the game, unless it's just something they can do, so if a character says, I want to sit down on the floor, they just do that in the game, and everybody's collective imagination. But if that player says, I want to hit that monster, or I want to try and convince the prince that I have the jewel in my pocket that he's looking for, the Dungeon Master will call for a roll. And then using these funky dice here, usually using the biggest of them, the 20-sided dice, or the D20, that player is going to roll the dice. And then there's some statistics and some math that happens essentially to decide whether that'll work. And there could be really bad things that happen if it doesn't. Maybe not so bad. But it certainly needs to pass some sort of threshold in order to succeed. So one example would be a wizard casting some sort of spell on another character that would cause that character to be under control of the wizard. That other character is going to try to resist that. And so they're going to roll their dice and add some modifiers and stuff, which I'm not really going to get into here, to see if they can resist that spell. And if they can't, then that character is under the control of the wizard in this example. Most of the other dice, the dice with less sides, are generally just used for applying damage in fights, because Dungeons and Dragons as a role-playing game generally revolves around a lot of combat. It doesn't necessarily have to have a lot of combat, but there usually is a fair deal each time. Now I say each time, what does that mean? Well, when you go play Dungeons and Dragons, you're playing a session. That might be anywhere from 2 to 8 hours, whatever you and the rest of the players want to do. And you can almost think of that as an episode of a TV show. So you play that session, and I should note there are no winners and losers. although the players might all die. You play that episode, and then you leave, and when you come back, it's the next episode. So you carry on from where you left off. And there are stories of Dungeons and Dragons games going on for years and years and decades. I think there's one I saw that's been going on for 30 years. I've never played one that long, but anyways, it's certainly possible. And so each session you're doing a little episode, and each episode will probably follow a bit of an arc, and each episode's probably going to have some combat. Each episode's probably going to have the player characters doing some, talking to people, traveling, adventuring, discovering things. Usually when I'm often the dungeon master or the game master, usually I try to keep it combat to less than half of the session, but sometimes it just gets away from me and it turns out to be more than that. And there's certainly sessions where very little, if not no combat happens. So you might be asking yourself, is there a board that you play on? Is there some sort of map?
Shouldn't there be a board or some pieces or something to Jenga?
No, this is a role-playing game. It takes place entirely in our collective imagination.
Ooh.
Are there any pieces other than these dice and these books we've seen? And the answer is kind of. I usually play Dungeons & Dragons online on a program called Roll20 at roll20.com. And basically that is a visualization software that everybody logs into and everybody can see the map and see the tokens and the little icons moving around. But traditionally, and a lot of people play like this, there is no map. There is no tokens. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's people who have these grand miniature sets and buildings and dungeons, and it takes up their entire basement. And they have little characters they move around through there. So you can kind of go either way. But I guess the power of role-playing games and the power of this game, Dungeons & Dragons, is that everything is in your mind. And a saying I always say is that the imagination is a dying animal.
You see, here at Creative Possibilities, we like to look at the world in a fresh and exciting way. The imagination is a dying animal, but here at Creative Possibilities, we like to feed that animal and give that animal room to roam. Office, submarine.
And the fun of Dungeons & Dragons is that you can do anything, or at least try to do anything. So if you're in a barroom brawl and you see a chandelier hang from the ceiling, you could try and cut its support, or you could try and jump on it. All you'd have to do is just ask the Dungeon Master, can I attempt to do this? And they'll probably ask for a roll, and you'll attempt it, and it might succeed or it might horribly fail. And that goes for everything. So you can come up with clever situations for clever remedies for any problem or situation you're in. If you're in jail, you might try and bribe the guard. If you're, traveling by sea, you might try to signal a passing ship to get directions. You can do anything, or once again, try to do anything. And it's usually the dungeon master's job to try and go along with that. And you can almost think of it as a game of improv, where the players that are all playing are sort of doing a yes and sort of thing, where someone's asking, can I do this? And the other player will respond, yes, and how about this happens? Now, the referee, the DM, the GM, they have to kind of get in the way of some of that a little bit if someone wants to do something that's against the spirit of the game. Or a good example would be, you as a player, as a person, might know that there's probably, you might encounter a troll, for example, and you know already that this troll is made susceptible to fire. So you might start doing stuff, and really your character wouldn't know that. So you can't actually, the Dungeon Master might jump in there and say, oh, actually you can't do that because your character would have no idea about that. But generally speaking, anything you try and do, you're going to be allowed to at least attempt. And that's where a lot of the fun comes from. That's where a lot of the story comes from. And a lot of the zany moments happen. Zany moments? Well, yes. If anything, Dungeons and Dragons is generally hilarious to play. it can be a little more serious, but it's usually pretty funny. And I'll just kind of describe 2 stories that have happened just to give you an idea of the kind of crazy stuff that can happen in a game. So in a recent game, the players were trying to talk to a local patron, a rich character in town, rich NPC. And they wanted to get something out of him, and he said, sure, I'll give you that thing, but you need to help me find something. And when they asked him what it was, he said it was actually a statue of a buttock, a marble statue. So that's a little strange. And he said it had been stolen by his rival, Gloomy McCleft, another dealer in these fine pieces of art. And so what the players did was they decided to disguise themselves as, well, one of them was a model, essentially a buttock model, and the other ones were the entourage. So there was the agent, there was the bodyguard, there was the handlers of this guy, and they went over to the rival's house and put on a show on the catwalk, I guess. So I guess it wasn't totally PG, but it was pretty funny. And they ended up stealing the statue back and had a lot of fun. So that's one story. Another story was I had another set of players, and they were in the house of once again, kind of a rich guy, I guess, in town, trying to get some horses, to buy horses from this fellow. And through conversation and just kind of noticing what he had in his house and his fancy footwear and some stuff they had heard, one of the players offered to have a dance-off with him, and then the winner would get a horse. I think the winner, if they won, they would get the horse they need, and if he won, they'd give him money or something like that. And so we rolled it off and had a lot of fun, and they got their horses and a great story out of it. Now those are 2 kind of weird zany stories, but there's also more epic stories, like this guy here, where you're fighting off an evil dragon and he's throwing fireballs and you're dodging them and stuff's exploding. So epic stuff can happen too. My games tend to be funnier, but anyways, each to their own. I guess what I'm trying to say is that you can tell your own stories, you can use your imagination, you can have more exciting stuff to happen than in the movies when you play Dungeons & Dragons. Alright, I just want to end the video with how to proceed. How do you get started in D&D? Well, I recommend getting their starter set. I think you can still get this. I don't know why you wouldn't be able to. It has kind of a mini booklet in it. It has an adventure, some dice. So that'll get you started if you want to run a game with your friends. But often what happens is you find a group of other players, or you're invited by some people to play Dungeons & Dragons, and you can just show up if that's the case. And they'll have dice for you, they'll have a book for you, a player's handbook it's called. There we go. And you can just get your feet wet, maybe do a bit of reading beforehand, but you really don't have to. They're going to help you create a character, they're going to help you figure out how to use these dice, how to read out of that book. Once you've been a player for a little while, you should really get your own book, and you should get your own dice instead of leeching off of others. And also I recommend just jumping right in and getting the Dungeon Master's Handbook and getting the Monster Manual, which we haven't talked about, and running a game for your friends. If you're the one watching this video and you want to introduce your friends to Dungeons & Dragons, you're the right person to do it. If you had enough if you're inspired enough to find a video on YouTube and look up what Dungeons & Dragons is and how to get into it, you can be a Dungeon Master. Go out and buy these 3 books and some dice. Take some time, a week or 2, reading over them, watching videos, and run a game. You'll have a blast. So you'll certainly stumble a bit, but you'll have a ton of fun. Alright guys, so that was my What is D&D video. It's a little longer than some of my other videos, but I hope you enjoyed it, especially people who have no idea what D&D is. I'll probably be doing a few more D&D related videos, especially if this one gets lots of views or whatever. So let me know down in the comments if you want more of that, and feel free to subscribe so you don't miss anything. And I'd just love to hear about your experiences with D&D if you've already tried it out. Alright, we will talk to you next time. Catch you later.